In this on-demand tutorial, we will be reviewing how to capture caregiver needs and strengths in the CANS. When looking at the caregiver domain, we see that there are three sections. The first is needs and strengths, which is all items 95 through 128. We also see that 129 to 131 is the commitment to permanency plan goal. This is for substitute caregivers only. And 132 to 139 is commitment to permanency plan goal. This will be scored for the permanent caregivers. Who is a caregiver? Biological parents, adoptive parents, step-parents, paramours, grandparents, pre-adoptive parents, foster parents or substitute caregivers, and legal guardians are all considered caregivers. In this slide, we see a guide that can be found on our CANS website. In the next few slides, we will be breaking down this information into smaller pieces. To determine which caregivers should be assessed, consider the following: the current permanency goal, the child's current household. So within that household, when the goal is return home, guardianship, or independence, or when the status is pending, the birth parent should be assessed whenever possible. When the child is currently living in a congregate setting, such as a residential home, group home, ILO, or TLP, you do not need to assess a caregiver, and the caregiver section will not need to be filled out for those substitute caregivers. For any caregiver that is assessed, we're going to be scoring 95 through 128. On the next slides, we will be talking more about substitute caregivers. When determining who to score, ask the following questions. Who are the caregivers? Who is involved with the child, and what is the goal? Items 123 to 129 are scored for any primary caregiver living in the home. For intact, this may be birth parents, step-parents, paramours, grandparents, or any other primary caregivers living in the home or providing primary care for the child. An example would be relatives caring for the child during the day while the parents are at work. Still looking at items 132 to 139. For placement cases, these caregivers may be birth parents, step-parents, paramours, grandparents, pre-adoptive parents, and again, any primary caregiver living in the home or providing primary care for the child. Finally, for a youth living in a congregate care setting, and the goal is return home, guardianship, independence, or the status is pending, the birth parent should be assessed on 132 to 139 whenever possible. Items 129 to 131 are scored for substitute caregivers. A substitute caregiver would be anyone caring for the child who is not a birth parent or adoptive parent. When looking at intact, these may be biological relatives or substitute caregivers. 129 to 131 may also be scored for some substitute caregivers or anyone caring for the child who is not a birth or adoptive parent. In placement, we see that these may be cases where there's specialized foster home, relative foster home, or foster homes, and the caregivers are providing primary care but are considered a substitute caregiver. And when looking at a congregate care setting, when the child is currently living in a residential home, group home, ILO, or TLP, you do not need to assess the caregiver, and therefore 129 to 131 will not be scored. It is important to keep in mind, families usually become DCFS involved because of concerns with the caregivers. Scoring the caregiver section accurately on all caregivers involved can help to identify these concerns. It is possible that there will still be actionable items at the close of the case. This is not a reflection of your work, but rather helps to identify continuing needs the caregiver or family may have. In the next section, we will be looking at how to score a caregiver within SACWIS. Access to the CWS CANS is gained by navigating from the Assessment tab from within the Case Management screen in SACWIS. From the family case, the CWS CANS will show all active members of the case. A CANS assessment will have to be performed for each individual that does not have a reason not assessed value. Make sure to select any and all children associated with each caregiver. This would include any child the caregiver has contact with. Each item of the CANS will allow the user to hover their mouse over and a pop-up message will appear to explain the scoring of the item. The linkages created on entry to the CANS between the caregivers and the children will drive the how the items within the CANS are associated. As seen below, some items will be displayed multiple times and will be required to be scored in each instance. This is due to some items being global and some being child-specific. A global item is a score that looks at the caregiver in relation to all children that were associated to them on the entry screen for the CANS. The child-specific item is an item that is scored by just looking at the relationship of the caregiver to each child specifically. This shows a few items that are considered global where one score applies to all children associated with the caregiver. We will now do some practice questions on how to score a caregiver. There's been a safety plan put in place for an intact family. The child is temporarily placed with relative substitute caregivers. Which caregivers would you score? In this scenario, you will be scoring the bio parents on number 95 through 128 and number 132 through 139. You will also be scoring any substitute caregivers on number 95 through 128 and number 129 to 131. You are working with an intact family. The child is living in the home with the bio parents, but the maternal grandmother also lives in the home. Who would you score the caregiver section on? In this situation, you would score mom, dad, and grandma on number 95 through 129 and number 132 to 139. Any primary caregivers living in the home should receive a CANS. True or false? If a child is placed in a congregate setting, such as a residential home, group home, or TLP, you do not need to assess a substitute caregiver. This is true. When a child is placed in congregate setting, you do not need to assess a substitute caregiver. However, the bio parent should be assessed whenever possible. True or false, you should complete a CANS for a paramour who is living in the home. True. Any primary caregiver living in the home should be scored. You will complete number 95 to 128 and number 132 to 139 for a paramour living in the home. True or false? A child who is living in a congregate setting and their status is return home, guardianship, or independence, or when the status is pending, the birth parent should be assessed whenever possible. True. You will complete number 95 to 128 and number 132 to 139 on the bio parents whenever possible.